"It's a barrier, David," she shrieked. Let me pause right there. Have you ever had someone yell at you before you've even had your first cup of coffee? It's a very specific, very agonizing kind of psychological warfare. You're just standing there. Your brain is still trying to render the textures of the physical world. Your eyes are barely open, and suddenly you are under verbal assault. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The Charleston morning air was already sitting at a disrespectful 88 degrees with 95% humidity. I was standing in my front yard wearing a pair of faded flannel pajama pants and a t-shirt that said "World's Okayest, brother." In my left hand, I was gently cradling a plastic garden gnome named Bartholomew. I won Bartholomew at a county fair ring toss game back in 2018. He's seen me through 2 breakups, a global pandemic, and a minor kitchen fire. He is my silent, bearded confidant. In my right hand, I held a small, dirt-caked gardening trowel, and standing precisely 12 inches from my nose was Brenda. Brenda is our Homeowners Association president. I need you to picture Brenda because every neighborhood has one. She treats her aluminum storage clipboard like a royal scepter. She wears a beige, water-resistant windbreaker that I am entirely convinced is lined with tactical Kevlar. She has a haircut that strictly demands to speak to the manager. And she patrols our cul-de-sac with the relentless, unblinking intensity of a Cold War border guard. Currently, she was crouched over my front flower bed, aggressively deploying a bright yellow Stanley retractable tape measure with the precision of a bomb squad technician disarming C4. Zip, she pulled the metal tape out. Snap, she locked it into place. 24 inches, she announced, her voice dripping with a kind of smug satisfaction, usually reserved for people who just solved a murder on a basic cable drama. She stood up, adjusting her sensible, UV-blocking visor. 2 feet of unauthorized, unapproved, and frankly unsightly perimeter enforcement. I looked down at the offending structure. It was a wire garden fence. You know the exact kind I'm talking about, right? The little, flimsy, dark green wire barriers you buy in a roll for $8 at the hardware store? The ones you can literally bend with your pinky finger? The ones that wouldn't keep out a determined squirrel, let alone pose a threat to the structural integrity of the neighborhood. I had put it up the night before as the sun went down, and I did it for one very specific, very frustrating, and very gross reason: the stray dog situation. Let me give you some context. Our neighborhood is lovely. It's historic, it's manicured, and the property values are absurd. But it has a fatal flaw. It is currently acting as the central hub for a roving pack of wandering, free-range canines who have collectively decided that my prize-winning, meticulously curated petunias are the ultimate, VIP exclusive bathroom destination. We're talking about an entire season of hard work. I bought the expensive, nitrogen-rich soil. I meticulously monitored the pH levels. I pruned them. I watered them. I talked to them. Yes, I talked to my plants. Don't look at me like that. Plants respond to positive vocal reinforcement. It's science. But all of that hard work was being systematically dismantled by a golden retriever named Barnaby who lives 3 houses down and exits his yard daily and pees like a high-pressure industrial fire hose. Have you ever watched a beautiful, vibrant flower dissolve under a daily barrage of acidic canine urine? It's heartbreaking. It is a slow, tragic death. I couldn't take it anymore. I wasn't trying to build the Great Wall of China. I just wanted to protect my flowers. Is that a crime? Apparently, in the sovereign republic of Brenda's HOA, it is a Class A felony. She tapped her aluminum clipboard with an aggressive, clicky ballpoint pen. Tap, tap, tap. Article 4, Section B of the Community Bylaws, David, she recited, not even looking at the paper. She had it memorized. Of course she had it memorized. I quote, "No unauthorized temporary perimeter structures shall be erected without the express written consent of the Architectural Review Committee." I blinked at her, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead with the back of the trowel. "Brenda, it's wire. It's green wire." "If we let you put up wire," she countered, her eyes narrowing behind her polarized sunglasses, "next it'll be chain link. And then after that, it's cinder blocks. And then before we know it, we're living in a prison camp, David. Is that what you want? To live in a gulag?" I took a deep, centering breath. I clutched Bartholomew the gnome a little tighter against my chest for emotional support. I looked around the cul-de-sac. The grass was practically glowing green. A lawn sprinkler was making that peaceful sound in the distance. A blue jay chirped. "Brenda," I said, dropping my voice to a dangerous deadpan calm. "It's knee-high. I can literally step over it without breaking my stride. Unless the inmates in this hypothetical prison camp are a gang of heavily armed, coordinated corgis, I think we're going to be perfectly safe. She didn't even crack a smile. Her face remained a mask of pure bureaucratic stone. I'm not laughing, David, she said, her voice dropping an octave. This is a clear, egregious violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards. Do you know what happens to property values when people start throwing up farm fencing wherever they please? Chaos. Anarchy. It's a 2-foot boundary for dog pee, I argued, gesturing wildly to the limp yellowing petunias behind the wire. Look at them, Brenda. They're dying. Barnaby is committing botanical homicide on a daily basis. Take it up with Barnaby's owners in civil court, she snapped smoothly. The HOA does not police local wildlife. We police property standards. I am officially issuing you a Class 2 violation fine. My jaw dropped. A fine? $500, she said, already writing on the pad. Effective immediately. $500, I yelled, my voice cracking slightly. A neighbor across the street, a nice old guy named Gary, stopped watering his driveway and openly stared at us. Brenda, the fence cost me $8. You are fining me $500 for an $8 piece of wire? The cost of the contraband is irrelevant to the penalty, she replied, pressing so hard with her pen I thought she was going to snap the carbon copy paper. Furthermore, you have exactly 48 hours to remove this barricade. If it is not removed by 7:15 a.m. on Thursday, you will incur an additional daily penalty of $100. She ripped the pink carbon copy sheet from her clipboard. She didn't hand it to me. Oh no. She slapped it directly onto the center of my chest, forcing me to pin it against my shirt, with the hand holding the garden trowel. Have a blessed day, David, she said. She turned on her orthopedic heels, the rubber soles squeaking aggressively on the wet morning concrete, and marched back down the sidewalk to go ruin someone else's morning. Probably Gary's. I stood there alone in my yard. I was seething. I was boiling. I was experiencing levels of pure, unfiltered, hot white rage previously unknown to a man holding a plastic garden gnome. $500. Do you know what I could do with $500? I could buy a PlayStation. I could buy a week's worth of groceries. I could buy 62 more rolls of this stupid green wire just to spite her. I looked down at the pink slip of paper crumpled against my chest. The handwriting was jagged, sharp, and entirely legible. Violation. Article 4. Section B. Penalty. I looked at the petunias. They looked back at me, drooping sadly in the morning humidity, a tragic casualty of neighborhood politics. Fine. I dropped the trowel. I set Bartholomew down gently on the grass. I grabbed the little green wire fence. I didn't even bother trying to unclip it or roll it up neatly. I just grabbed the top wire, planted my feet, and yanked the entire thing out of the dirt in one violent, muddy, frustrated motion. Chunks of topsoil went flying onto the sidewalk. I balled the wire up into a chaotic, tangled mess, marched over to my Green City trash can, and spiked it inside like I was scoring a touchdown in the Super Bowl. I went inside my house. I didn't even make coffee. I marched straight to my home office, booted up my computer, and slammed my fingers onto the keyboard. I navigated to the official, poorly designed, mid-2000s era neighborhood HOA portal. I logged in. The notification was already there, flashing in aggressive red text across the top of the dashboard. Outstanding balance. I pulled out my credit card. I typed in the numbers with enough force to threaten the structural integrity of my keyboard. The portal charged me a $15, zero convenience fee for using a card. Because of course it did. Click. Submit. Payment successful. Why did I pay it immediately? Because I wanted a clean slate. I didn't want them sending threatening letters in the mail. I didn't want them putting a lien on my house. Above all, I wanted them to have absolutely zero leverage on their end. I wanted Brenda to check the ledger, see the $500 cleared, and think she had won. I wanted her to feel secure. I shut my laptop. I sat in my ergonomic office chair, staring at the blank wall, fuming. I was plotting. But I had nothing. My brain was completely clouded with red-hot, irrational anger. I spent the next 4 hours wandering around my house, muttering to myself, imagining completely impossible scenarios where the HOA was somehow disbanded by a Supreme Court ruling. And then, the sky darkened. If you don't live in the South, you might not understand how weather works here during the summer. It doesn't transition. It doesn't ease into a storm. One minute, it is 90 degrees and aggressively sunny. The next minute, the sky turns the color of a bruised plum. The air pressure drops so fast your ears pop, and the clouds open up like a ruptured water tower. It started to rain, not just a drizzle. A classic, torrential, out-of-now-here Carolina downpour. The rain hit the roof with a deafening roar. Thunder rattled the windows in their frames. I stood up and walked over to the front window, leaning my forehead against the cool glass. I watched the water hit my front lawn. I watched it pool near the sidewalk, overwhelming the street drains within minutes. And then, I looked at the flower bed. Without the little green wire fence there to break up the flow, the water was cascading off the slope of my yard, running straight down, and pooling directly where the fence used to be. The divots left by the metal stakes were filling up. A small, muddy, fast-moving puddle was forming right on the perimeter. I watched the water rise, half an inch, and right there, staring through the rain-streaked glass, watching the water threaten to wash my precious topsoil straight onto the concrete, an idea sparked. It was tiny at first, a flicker. But as I watched the puddle grow, the idea grew with it. It blossomed into something beautiful, something petty, something legally unassailable and utterly, magnificently chaotic. My yard was holding water. My property was experiencing a localized inundation. And I remembered something I had seen on the local news just a few weeks prior, right before hurricane season officially kicked off. A slow, terrifying Grinch-like smile spread across my face. I didn't need a wire fence to keep the dogs out. I needed to protect my home. The HOA could dictate the rules of landscaping. They could tell me what color to paint my mailbox. They could tell me how tall my grass could be. But there was one thing the HOA had absolutely zero jurisdiction over: Mother Nature and the federal government. The rain was still hammering the roof of my house, a rhythmic, aggressive drumbeat that perfectly matched the chaotic energy vibrating inside my skull. I needed coffee, artisanal, lightly roasted, pour-over nonsense. I usually drank on a leisurely Tuesday. I needed the dark, sludgy, hyper-caffeinated motor oil you find at highway gas stations at 3 in the morning. I went into the kitchen, loaded a ridiculous amount of espresso grounds into the machine, and waited for the dark elixir of vengeance to brew. I stood leaning against the granite counter, watching the black liquid drip into my mug, my mind racing. $500. That number kept flashing behind my eyes like a neon sign in a cheap motel. She had taken $500 of my hard-earned dollars over a piece of wire that weighed less than a wet towel. I took a sip of the scalding espresso. It tasted like burnt earth and raw determination. Perfect. I carried the mug back to my home office and sat down at my desk. I cracked my knuckles. I rolled my neck. It was time to go to war. But I wasn't going to fight Brenda with emotion. I was going to fight her with her own weapon, weaponized bureaucracy. I opened up the Oakwood Estates Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Let me paint a picture of this document for you. It is a 64-page PDF. It is written entirely in Times New Roman, size 11 font, with single spacing and margins so narrow they practically fall off the screen. It was clearly drafted by a team of lawyers who were paid by the word and had never experienced a single moment of joy in their entire lives. It is the Magna Carta of micromanagement, the Dead Sea Scrolls of suburban tyranny. I started reading. I didn't just skim. I read every single line, every subclause, every footnote. I was looking for the exceptions. If Brenda could use Article 4, Section B to ban my wire fence, there had to be something else I could use to bypass it. What can I build? I read through the landscaping guidelines. Clause 7.1.4. Decorative boulders are permitted, provided they do not exceed 18 inches in diameter and are naturally occurring colors. Slate, gray, sandstone. My thought: no, too expensive, and the dogs will just pee on the boulders. Clause 9.3.2. Retaining walls may only be constructed of approved brick matching the primary residence, requiring a 6-month architectural review process. My thought: no, I don't have 6 months. My petunias don't have 6 days. Clause 11.5. Fountains and water features must not exceed a decibel level of... I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. The document was a fortress. It was an ironclad cage designed to keep everything uniform, beige, and entirely defenseless against roaming bladder-heavy golden retrievers. There were no loopholes for fences. The wording was airtight. No unauthorized temporary perimeter structures of any kind, including but not limited to wire, wood, plastic, or mesh, shall be erected without express written consent. I leaned back in my chair, groaning out loud. I spun around to look out the window again. The rain was unrelenting. It was one of those massive coastal storm systems that park themselves over the city and refuse to leave. The puddle in my front yard, the one occupying the exact footprint of my confiscated wire fence, had grown. It was no longer a puddle. It was a miniature lake. It was encroaching on the sidewalk. It was threatening the structural integrity of my mulch. I stared at the water. Charleston, South Carolina is a beautiful, historic, culinary masterpiece of a city. But geographically speaking, it is a soup bowl built on top of a swamp. We are surrounded by rivers, marshes, the harbor, and the Atlantic Ocean. When the tide is high and the rain comes down, the water has nowhere to go. It just sits there. The streets flood, the yards flood, occasionally the restaurants flood. It is an undeniable, inescapable fact of coastal living. We are basically Atlantis waiting to happen. I watched a stray oak leaf float across my new front yard lake. Water, I thought. She can control the dirt. She can control the grass. She can control the fences. But she can't control the water. If local HOA law bans me from protecting my flowers with a fence, what higher power mandates me to protect my property from the water? My eyes snapped wide open. I practically threw myself back at the computer keyboard. I closed the PDF of the HOA bylaws. I was done with Brenda's petty little fiefdom. I was moving up the food chain. I bypassed municipal code. I bypassed state law. I went straight to the top of the mountain. I opened a new tab and typed, Federal Emergency Management Agency. Welcome to the swamp, Brenda. If you have never navigated a government website, let me prepare you. It is a terrifying user experience. The FEMA Flood Map Service Center looks like it was coded in 1998 by someone who actively hated the internet. The layout is confusing, the buttons are unresponsive, and the loading times are borderline geological. But right then, to me, it was the most beautiful digital landscape on Earth. I clicked on the search by address bar. My hands were actually shaking with anticipation. I typed in my street number, my street name, Charleston, SC, and my zip code. I hit enter. A little spinning globe icon appeared. Processing. The tension in the room was palpable. I took another gulp of my sludge espresso. My eyes were glued to the screen. Come on, you beautiful bureaucratic disaster. Give me what I need. The screen refreshed. A highly detailed topographical map of my neighborhood materialized. And overlaying the map were various colored zones, shaded in blues, purples, and alarming reds. I zoomed in on Oakwood Estates. I zoomed in on my cul-de-sac. I placed my mouse cursor directly over the little digital square that represented my house. A pop-up box appeared. Property designation, Zone A base flood elevation, 11 feet. Special flood hazard area, SFA. Yes, I let out a sound that was half law, half gasp. I actually slapped my desk. Yes, I shouted to the empty room. Bartholomew the gnome watched me silently from the corner of the desk, sharing in my triumph. For those of you who aren't fluent in federal floodplain management jargon, let me translate. Zone AE is the government's way of saying, hey, you live in a bathtub, and when it rains, you are at a statistically high risk of going underwater. It means my property is officially designated as a special flood hazard area, subject to inundation by the 1% annual chance flood event. But having the designation wasn't enough. I needed the directive. I needed the legal shield. I opened another tab and pulled up the National Flood Insurance Program. Official guidelines for homeowners in Zone AE. I scrolled past the insurance premium tables, past the elevation certificate requirements, straight into the section labeled Pre-Disaster Mitigation and Emergency Protective Measures. I found the paragraph. I read it once. I blinked hard, wiped my eyes, and read it again, reading it aloud to the empty room just to hear how sweet it sounded. Homeowners residing in special flood hazard areas, Zone A, AEV, VE, are strongly encouraged to implement temporary flood mitigation strategies during periods of expected heavy rainfall or seasonal storm threats, recognizing the immediate need to protect life and property. The deployment of temporary emergency flood barriers, including but not limited to sandbags, water-filled barriers, and temporary flood shields, is considered a necessary and federally protected mitigation activity. I stopped reading. A massive, Grinch-like smile slowly stretched across my face. Federally protected mitigation activity. Let's talk about the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution for a second. Article 6, Paragraph 2 establishes that the federal Constitution and federal law generally take precedence over state laws and even state constitutions. This principle is absolute. If federal law trumps state law and state law trumps municipal code, where does an HOA board sit? An HOA is nothing but a localized civil contract. It is the lowest possible form of authority on the legal totem pole. It is a microscopic speck of dust on the boot of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. If the HOA bylaws say you cannot build a temporary perimeter structure, but the federal government says you are strongly encouraged and legally protected to deploy a temporary emergency flood barrier, who wins? Uncle Sam wins. Every single time. The HOA cannot legally override a federal emergency flood directive. If they tried, they would be obstructing a homeowner's federally recognized right to protect their property from a designated natural hazard. The plot crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. It was a masterpiece of malicious compliance. It all came down to terminology. Words matter in law. Words are everything. A 2-foot wire fence? That is a temporary perimeter structure. Brenda was right. The bylaws banned it. I couldn't use wire. Wire is for containing things. Wire is for aesthetics. But sandbags? A stack of heavy, dirt-filled, military-grade burlap sacks? Those are not a fence. Those are not a perimeter structure. Those have absolutely nothing to do with landscaping, aesthetics, or keeping dogs out. Those are emergency flood mitigation devices. I looked out the window again. The puddle had breached the sidewalk. It was a sign from the heavens. The rainy season in Charleston was just beginning. Hurricane season was lurking right around the corner. The threat of inundation was real, present, and documented by the United States government. Who was I, a humble, law-abiding citizen, to ignore the strong encouragement of FEMA? I had a civic duty to protect my property. I had a moral obligation to mitigate flood damage. And if those emergency flood mitigation devices just happened to form an impenetrable, knee-high fortress perfectly encircling my award-winning petunias, thus acting as an impenetrable physical barrier against a certain bladder-happy golden retriever? Well, that was just a happy coincidence, a secondary benefit of proactive homeownership. I imagined Brenda's face. I imagined her pulling out her little yellow tape measure and trying to fine me for complying with federal emergency protocols. The joy it brought me was intoxicating, but I couldn't just put down a few bags. That would look weak. If you are going to weaponize a federal loophole, you cannot half-step. You have to commit to the bit. You have to go all the way. I wasn't going to build a little bump in the grass. I was going to build a levee. I was going to build a structure so undeniably robust, so militantly functional, that nobody could possibly mistake it for a decorative garden border. It needed to look like I was preparing for the biblical flood. It needed to look like a World War I trench. I pulled out my phone. It was 8:30 a.m. I opened Google Maps and searched commercial landscaping supply near me. I skipped the boutique garden centers. I skipped the places that sold organic compost and decorative koi ponds. I scrolled until I found a place on the industrial outskirts of North Charleston. A place with a gravel parking lot and pictures of massive yellow front-end loaders. Low country dirt and stone. Commercial bulk supply. I tapped the phone number. It rang 3 times. Low country, this is Mike. A gruff, gravelly voice answered. Mike sounded like a guy who smoked 2 packs a day and ate gravel for breakfast. He sounded perfect. Mike, good morning, my friend, I chirped. I was absolutely vibrating with adrenaline. The caffeine and the spite were merging into a superpower. I am a residential homeowner, but I have a highly specific, very large commercial-scale order for you. And I need it delivered to my driveway as soon as humanly possible. There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of a diesel engine idling in the background. All right, buddy, Mike said slowly, clearly skeptical of my energetic tone. What exactly are you looking for? Mike, sand. Specifically, I need your heaviest, most compactable utility sand. None of that fine white playground stuff. I need the gritty structural stuff. And I need the sacks. The military-grade heavy-duty woven polypropylene or burlap sandbags. Do you stock those? Yeah, we stock 'em, Mike grunted. Usually sell 'em to the county when the king tides roll in. How much sand you need? A yard? 2 yards? I looked out the window at my front yard. I mentally measured the perimeter of the flower bed. It was a long curve, maybe 40 feet total. To build a proper, interlocking, staggered brick pattern wall that was at least 2 feet high and 2 feet deep, I was going to need a massive volume of material. I thought about Brenda's $500 fine. I thought about the smug look on her face when she slapped that pink carbon copy onto my chest. Mike, I said, leaning into the microphone of my phone, my voice dropping to a dead serious whisper. I need 10 tons of sand. 10 tons? Mike repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Buddy, you know how big a pile 10 tons is? It's going to take up your whole driveway. You building a foundation? I am building an emergency flood mitigation barrier, Mike, in accordance with FEMA Zone AE guidelines. Mike let out a low whistle. Okay, 10 tons of structural utility sand. And how many bags do you want me to throw in the bundle? I smiled. A full, unhinged, beautiful smile. 500, I said. 500 bags, Mike asked, now sounding genuinely concerned for my mental well-being. Listen, man, unless you're expecting Noah's Ark to float down your street, 500 bags is a lot of labor. You got a crew to help you fill 'em? Just me, Mike. Just me and my trowel. All right, man, your funeral. I can have a dump truck and a flatbed out to your place by 7 a.m. tomorrow. That work for you? That is absolutely perfect, Mike. See you tomorrow. I hung up the phone. I took the last sip of my coffee. The rain continued to fall, filling the puddles, setting the stage. I looked at Bartholomew the gnome. Get ready, old friend, I whispered. Things are about to get heavy. Beep, beep, beep. There is a very specific frequency to the reverse alarm of a commercial-grade, heavy-duty dump truck. In a construction zone, it simply means, hey, large vehicle moving backward, don't get crushed. But in the aggressively tranquil, hyper-manicured, birds chirping environment of Oakwood Estates at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, that sound is the auditory equivalent of an air raid siren. It is the sound of the social order fracturing. I was already awake. To be perfectly honest, I hadn't really slept. I was vibrating on a volatile mixture of residual spite, anticipation, and way too much espresso. I was standing in my driveway, wearing my grungiest pair of cargo shorts, a beat-up pair of work boots, and a t-shirt I didn't mind permanently destroying. I held my coffee mug with two hands, watching the spectacle unfold. A massive, six-wheeled Peterbilt dump truck, caked in a thick layer of industrial grime and roaring like a waking dragon, was slowly backing its way up my pristine, exposed aggregate driveway. Directly behind it was a flatbed truck carrying a pallet wrapped in black plastic. The diesel exhaust was thick and pungent, a glorious, toxic cloud of blue smoke rolling over the flawlessly trimmed lawns of my neighbors. The Peterbilt hissed its air brakes and shuddered to a halt, shaking the very foundation of my two-story colonial. The driver's side door groaned open, and Mike stepped out. Mike was exactly the man his voice had promised. He looked like he had been carved out of a block of concrete and then left in the sun to cure. He was wearing steel-toed boots, jeans that had seen better decades, and a high-vis yellow vest over a flannel shirt. He took off his grease-stained baseball cap, wiped a layer of sweat and dust from his forehead, and looked around the cul-de-sac. He looked at my neighbor Susan's perfectly sculpted topiary bushes. He looked at Gary's impeccably edged driveway. Then he looked at me, standing in my driveway holding a mug of coffee and smiling like an absolute psychopath. Mike walked over, a clipboard in hand, scratching the back of his head. You David? He asked, his voice a low gravel crunch. I am David, I said, extending a hand. Welcome to Oakwood Estates, Mike. Mike shook my hand. His grip felt like a bench vise. He looked over his shoulder at the 10-wheel behemoth idling in my driveway, then back to my perfectly ordinary suburban home. Buddy, Mike said, his eyebrows furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. You ordered 10 tons of structural utility sand and 500 military-grade, woven polypropylene burlap sacks. I gotta ask, are you building a bunker? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I looked over at the front flower bed. The petunias were looking particularly tragic this morning. Their yellowing leaves a silent testament to Barnaby the Golden Retriever's reign of terror. Just protecting my petunias, Mike, I said, my voice deadpan. Just protecting the petunias. Mike stared at me for a long, heavy 4 seconds. He was clearly trying to calculate if I was clinically insane or just deeply eccentric. Finally, he shrugged, a universal contractor gesture that meant, the check cleared, so I don't care. Where do you want the mountain? He asked. Right here. I pointed to the center of the driveway, ensuring I left exactly enough room for my car in the garage, but completely blocking the visual line of sight from the street. Mike nodded, gave a hand signal to the driver, and walked back to the truck. Have you ever seen 10 tons of sand dropped onto a residential driveway? It is not a subtle event. The massive hydraulic lift whined, screaming against the weight. The bed of the truck began to tilt upward, and then the tailgate released. Whoosh! Crash! It sounded like a localized avalanche. A literal mountain of gritty, beige structural sand poured out, creating a massive, sprawling dune that swallowed the concrete. A cloud of fine silica dust plumed into the air, drifting lazily toward Brenda's house at the end of the block. Next, the flatbed driver unstrapped the pallet, hopped on a portable forklift, and dropped a massive, heavy, plastic-wrapped cube of 500 burlap sacks right next to the sand dune. Mike handed me the invoice. I signed it. "Good luck with the petunias, man," Mike said, climbing back into his rig. "Appreciate it, Mike. Drive safe." The trucks rumbled away, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. I stood alone in my driveway, dwarfed by a beige Everest of dirt. Let's pause here and talk about logistics. Let's talk about the physical reality of what I had just done. 10 tons is 20,000 pounds. One standard military-grade sandbag holds about 40 pounds of sand when filled to the optimal 2/3 capacity. You don't fill them to the top, or they won't stack correctly. This is a fun fact I learned at 2 a.m. on the FEMA website. 20,000 divided by 40 is exactly 500 bags. To complete this malicious compliance masterpiece, I, a man whose primary form of physical exertion is carrying all the groceries inside in a single trip, had to manually shovel 20,000 pounds of dirt into 500 individual sacks. I went to the garage and retrieved my weapons: a heavy-duty, flat-nosed steel shovel, a roll of duct tape, and a 2-foot length of PVC pipe. Pro tip: if you ever have to fill sandbags alone, you duct tape the burlap sack to the PVC pipe to hold the mouth open. Otherwise, you're shoveling dirt onto your own feet. I stabbed the shovel into the pile. The sandbag symphony had officially begun. Day 1, the foundation of spite by 9 a.m. The temperature was a humid 85 degrees. By bag number 15, I was sweating through my shirt. By bag number 30, I realized that I had made a terrible, grueling, spectacular mistake. But spite is an incredible pre-workout supplement. Every time my lower back screamed, I thought of Brenda's smug face measuring my wire fence. Every time a blister threatened to form on my palm, I thought of that $500 fine. I established a rhythm: shovel, lift, dump, tie the bag, haul the bag, drop the bag, repeat. I started laying the foundation along the exact perimeter where my flimsy little green wire fence used to be. The FEMA guidelines were very specific about how to build a proper flood wall. You don't just stack them on top of each other like a tower of blocks. You have to lay them lengthwise, parallel to the direction of the water flow. You have to overlap the seams, like laying bricks. You have to stomp on each bag after you place it to lock it into the bags below, creating a watertight seal. By noon, I had completed the entire base layer. It was a beautiful, solid ring of heavy tan burlap tracing the edge of my lawn. That was when the neighbors started noticing. Oakwood Estates is the kind of neighborhood where people walk their designer dogs in the middle of the day. A woman named Carol, who I'm pretty sure communicates exclusively through passive-aggressive Facebook posts, walked by with her labradoodle. She stopped on the sidewalk. She stared at the mountain of sand. She stared at the base layer of bags. She stared at me, covered in dirt, sweat pouring down my face, stomping aggressively on a burlap sack. "David?" she called out, her voice laced with deep concern. "What on earth are you doing?" I wiped my brow with the back of a filthy glove. "Flood mitigation, Carol. Hurricane season is coming. FEMA Zone AE. I gave her a vigorous thumbs up. She slowly pulled her labradoodle closer, wide-eyed, and speed-walked away. At 2 p.m., Gary from across the street wandered over. Gary is retired. Gary's lawn looks like a professional golf course. Gary also notoriously hates Brenda, ever since she cited him for having a non-regulation decorative wreath on his front door during Thanksgiving. Gary stood at the edge of my driveway, hands in his pockets, assessing the situation. "That's a lot of dirt, Dave," Gary observed. "It's 20,000 pounds, Gary. What's the play here?" "Brenda fined me $500 for my wire fence," I explained, leaning on my shovel, catching my breath. "Claimed it was an unauthorized temporary perimeter structure. But she can't ban emergency flood mitigation devices. It's federal law." Gary looked at the trench starting to form around the petunias. He looked at the mountain of sand. A slow, incredibly warm smile spread across his weathered face. "Dave," Gary said softly, "you're a madman." "I try, Gary. You want a Gatorade?" "Gary, if you bring me a blue Gatorade, I will put you in my will." By 7 p.m. the sun was setting. My shoulders felt like they had been hit by a truck. My hands were vibrating. But the wall was now 2 levels high. It was 18 inches of dense, impenetrable military-grade fortification. And right as I was packing it in for the night, the ultimate test occurred. Barnaby, the bladder-heavy golden retriever, trotted down the sidewalk, entirely off his leash, his owner nowhere in sight. He made a beeline for my flower bed. He approached the perimeter. He stopped. He sniffed the heavy burlap. He tried to step over it, but 18 inches is awkwardly high for a dog trying to casually lift a leg. The wall was too thick, too solid. Barnaby let out a confused whine, sniffed the bag one more time, and then turned around and trotted over to Brenda's lawn across the street to relieve himself. I stood on my porch, covered in grime, and pumped a fist into the air. Victory, day 2. The trench takes shape if day 1 was fueled by adrenaline. Day 2 was fueled purely by psychotic momentum. I woke up, and my entire body felt like it had been run through a meat grinder. But I had a job to do. I had a wall to build. I was out in the driveway by 7:30 a.m. The aesthetic of the project was really starting to take shape, and the visual contrast was nothing short of cinematic comedy. Imagine a row of beautiful $500,000 suburban homes. The grass is hilly green. The driveways are pressure-washed. There are decorative flags hanging from the porches. And then, right in the middle of it all, is my house. I had transformed my front lawn into the demilitarized zone. The wall was growing. It was no longer just a border. It was becoming a barricade. I was stacking them 3 deep at the base and pyramiding them upward to ensure structural integrity. By 1 p.m., the wall was 3 feet high. It was completely obscuring the petunias from the street. If you walked by on the sidewalk, you couldn't even see my front door unless you were 6 feet tall. The neighborhood traffic had noticeably increased. Cars were driving by at 5 miles per hour, the drivers rolling down their windows, staring in absolute bewilderment. Some people were taking pictures with their phones. A UPS driver pulled up to drop off a package. He stepped out of his brown truck, looked at the massive, zigzagging fortress of sandbags, looked at the half-depleted mountain of sand in the driveway, and started laughing so hard he had to lean against his truck. "Man," the driver wheezed, handing me a small Amazon box over the top of the barricade. "I don't know what kind of war you're fighting, but I think you're winning." "Thank you, soldier," I replied, saluting him with my duct-taped PVC pipe. The anti-Brenda faction of the neighborhood was quietly rallying behind me. Gary brought me a plate of his wife's chocolate chip cookies. A neighbor from 3 streets over, a guy named Phil, who had once been fined $100 for leaving his garage door open for an hour, drove by and honked his horn, yelling, "Hold the line!" out the window. But I knew the clock was ticking. Brenda had given me 48 hours to remove the wire fence. That deadline was fast approaching. If I wanted the trap to be perfectly set, the wall had to be finished before she came back with her clipboard. I worked through the afternoon. I worked through the evening. I set up halogen work lights in my yard and worked under the harsh, industrial glow while the rest of the neighborhood watched Jeopardy and ate. Dinner, shovel, lift, dump, tie, carry, stomp. I was a machine. I was the architect of my own petty destiny. Day 3. The Fortress of Petuniatude. It was Thursday morning. The 48-hour deadline hit at 7:15 a.m. At 6:30 a.m., I laid the final bag. Bag number 500. I dropped it onto the top tier. I stood on top of the base layer, raised my heavy work boot, and stomped the final bag down, locking it perfectly into the W1 trench line. I stepped back to the street to admire my work. It was glorious. It was a masterpiece of malicious compliance. The wall was 4 feet high. It was 2 feet thick at the top and 3 feet thick at the base. It spanned the entire 40-foot perimeter of the flower bed, curving aggressively around the corner of the driveway and hooking back toward the porch to create an impenetrable, watertight seal. It was utterly, hilariously hideous. It looked exactly like archival footage from the Battle of the Somme if the Battle of the Somme had taken place in a Better Homes and Gardens catalog. The heavy, dark tan burlap was rough and militaristic. The sheer mass of the structure commanded respect. The driveway was completely empty. I had moved all 10 tons of sand. There was not a single green wire fence in sight. Instead, I had erected a Category 5 hurricane-grade flood mitigation levee in the middle of a perfectly clear, sunny 88-degree Charleston morning. I walked over to the hose, rinsed the dirt off my arms and face, and went inside. I changed into a clean pair of khakis and a crisp button-down shirt. I made a fresh cup of coffee, a nice civilized pour-over this time. I walked out onto my front porch. I stood behind my 4-foot barricade, completely hidden from the street from the chest down. I placed Bartholomew the gnome directly on top of the highest sandbag, facing the street like a tiny bearded sentinel. I checked my watch. 7:10 a.m. Right on cue, the squeak of orthopedic rubber soles hitting the concrete echoed down the cul-de-sac. I took a sip of my coffee. I leaned my elbows on the top of my sandbags. It was time to play defense. At exactly 7:14 a.m., the rhythmic, Aggressive squeak of Brenda's orthopedic rubber soles reached my ears. She was approaching from the east side of the cul-de-sac. I couldn't see her yet, because my 4-foot-high, 2-foot-thick burlap fortress completely blocked my peripheral vision. But I knew that sound anywhere. It was the sound of approaching doom. The sound of HOA tyranny on the march. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my pour-over coffee. I leaned my forearms against the rough, dusty top of bag number 500. Bartholomew the gnome sat proudly beside me, staring out at the street. The squeaking grew louder, faster, and then she rounded the curve of the sidewalk and stepped into view. Brenda was wearing her tactical beige windbreaker, her polarized visor pulled down low, and she had her aluminum clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. She was walking with purpose. She was walking with the specific, arrogant gait of a woman who fully expected to see me dismantling a flimsy wire fence in tearful, defeated humiliation. She didn't look up at first. She was looking down at her clipboard, uncapping her pen with her teeth. She took 3 more steps until she was directly in front of my property line. Then she looked up. If I could bottle the exact facial expression she made at that moment, I would sell it as a cure for depression. It was a masterpiece. First, there was total blank confusion. Her brain simply refused to process the visual information being fed to it by her optic nerves. She blinked rapidly. She took a step backward. She looked at my house number, then looked at the house next door, verifying that she was, in fact, at the correct address. Then the confusion morphed into shock. Her jaw actually dropped. The pen fell from her hand and clattered onto the concrete sidewalk, and finally, the shock crystallized into pure, unadulterated, vein-popping fury. Her face turned a shade of mottled crimson that I usually only associate with boiled lobsters. She stared at the massive, sweeping W1-style trench fortification, completely swallowing my front yard. She marched up to the barricade. At 4 feet high, the top layer of sandbags hit her right in the sternum. I leaned over the top, looking down at her with the polite, serene expression of a monk who has just achieved total enlightenment. "Good morning, Brenda," I said brightly. "Beautiful day in the neighborhood, isn't it?" she sputtered. Actual saliva flew from her lips. She pointed a trembling finger at the wall. "David, what in the name of all that is holy is this?" "It's 7:15 a.m., I noted, checking my watch. "I just wanted to make sure you saw that the wire fence has been completely removed." I paid the $500 fine, as requested, and the unauthorized temporary perimeter structure is gone. Full compliance. Brenda slammed both hands down on the top of a sandbag. A little puff of silica dust rose into the air, making her cough. "Are you out of your mind?" she shrieked. Her voice echoed off the vinyl siding of the surrounding houses. Gary, across the street, paused on his porch with the morning paper, deeply invested in the drama. "You tore down a wire fence and built a military compound. This is a monstrosity. This is an eyesore. This is a violation of every single aesthetic covenant in the Oakwood Estates bylaws." "Oh, Brenda, you misunderstand," I said, my voice dripping with false concern. "This isn't a landscaping choice. This is an emergency measure. We are in a state of high readiness." "Readiness for what?" she screamed. "The apocalypse?" "Inundation, Brenda. We are preparing for inundation." I reached down to my feet, where I had prepared a special manila folder. I opened it and pulled out a freshly printed, high-gloss, full-color copy of the FEMA Zone AE flood hazard map. I slid it across the top of the sandbags toward her. "I was doing some light reading after you cited me," I explained smoothly, "and I discovered something horrifying. Our neighborhood, specifically, my property, is located squarely in a federal special flood hazard area." "Did you know that?" "We are sitting ducks, Brenda. Sitting ducks in a bathtub." She stared at the map like it was laced with anthrax. "I don't care about a map, David. You are building an unpermitted, unauthorized structure on your front lawn. Article 4, Section B clearly states." "I'm going to stop you right there, Brenda," I interrupted, raising a single finger. "Article 4, Section B prohibits unauthorized perimeter structures. But these," I patted the burlap affectionately, "these are emergency flood mitigation devices." She blinked at me. The bureaucratic gears in her head were grinding against each other, throwing sparks. "I cross-referenced the National Flood Insurance Program guidelines," I continued, my voice steady and authoritative. "FEMA strongly encourages and federally protects the proactive deployment of temporary flood barriers, including sandbags, during the rainy season. As the HOA president, I'm sure you're aware that under the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, Federal emergency directives strictly supersede local HOA covenants. I took another sip of coffee. Basically, Brenda, the federal government told me to build this. And as a law-abiding patriot, I couldn't say no. For a moment, there was total silence. The only sound was a lawnmower starting up 3 blocks over. Brenda looked at the map. She looked at the 10,000 pounds of dirt separating her from my petunias. She looked at me, standing in my khakis, completely untouchable. Her hand started to shake. She grabbed her aluminum clipboard, clutching it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You think you're clever?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you found a loophole? You think you can make a mockery of this neighborhood and hide behind some bureaucratic technicality." "I think I'm protecting my property from water damage," I smiled. "This is a public nuisance," she yelled, stepping back. "This is a hazard." "You are unhinged, David. I am not dealing with this internally anymore. I am calling the authorities." She ripped a smartphone out of her windbreaker pocket. Her thumbs pounded against the screen. She brought the phone to her ear, glaring daggers at me through her polarized lenses. "Yes, hello, police," she said, her voice dropping into the dramatic, breathless register of a woman reporting a bank robbery. "I need officers dispatched to 442 Sycamore Lane immediately." "Yes, Oakwood Estates. I have a resident who has suffered some sort of mental break. He has barricaded his property with an illegal, massive fortress. It's a threat to public safety. Yes, I'll wait." She hung up, giving me a look of absolute triumph. "They're on their way. Let's see if your little FEMA map works on the Charleston Police Department." "Fantastic," I said, utterly unfazed. "Would you like a cup of coffee while we wait? I have a lovely Ethiopian dark roast." She let out a sound that was half growl, half shriek, crossed her arms over her chest, and stood squarely on the sidewalk, acting as a one-woman blockade. The wait was the best part of the morning. Word had apparently spread. Neighbors started filtering out of their houses under the guise of checking the mail or watering the grass. Gary pulled a folding aluminum lawn chair out of his garage, popped it open at the end of his driveway, and sat down with his coffee, openly spectating. Susan from down the street walked by twice, making intense eye contact with the Sandbags. I didn't move. I stayed right at my post, leaning on bag 500, sipping my coffee, occasionally waving at Gary. Brenda stood on the sidewalk, radiating pure, toxic energy, refusing to break eye contact with me. 10 minutes later, the cavalry arrived. A white and blue Charleston Police Department Ford Explorer rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac. Its tires crunched against the asphalt as it pulled up to the curb, right behind Brenda. The light bar wasn't flashing. It wasn't an emergency response, but the presence of law enforcement instantly elevated the drama to a 10. The front doors popped open. 2 officers stepped out. The driver was a younger guy, maybe late 20s, with the nameplate Officer Jenkins. He looked sharp, alert, and ready for action. The passenger was an older, stockier cop named Officer Martinez, who looked like he had been on the force for 30 years and was deeply, profoundly tired of dealing with suburban nonsense. They adjusted their duty belts and walked toward Brenda. Then they saw the wall. Jenkins stopped dead in his tracks. His hand hovered over his radio. He stared at the 4-foot-high, 40-foot-long, military-grade W1 trench spanning my front yard. He looked at me, leaning casually over the top of it with a ceramic coffee mug and a plastic garden gnome. Martinez just sighed. A deep, heavy sigh that came from the soul. "Officers, thank God you're here." Brenda rushed forward, waving her clipboard. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I called you. This man, David, has completely lost his mind. He has erected an illegal, hazardous compound in the middle of our neighborhood." Officer Martinez took off his sunglasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, is there a hostage situation going on here that dispatch didn't mention?" "No," Brenda cried. "He's violating the HOA bylaws. He dumped 10 tons of dirt on his lawn and stacked it into a barricade. It's a public nuisance. It's an unpermitted structure. I want him cited, and I want this removed immediately." The 2 cops walked up to the wall. They looked at the heavy burlap. They looked at the perfectly staggered, interlocking joints. Jenkins reached out and poked one of the bags with his finger. It didn't budge. "That's a solid wall," Jenkins murmured, sounding genuinely impressed. "You do this yourself, buddy?" 500 bags, officer, I said proudly. "Started Tuesday. Finished this morning." "Impressive," Jenkins nodded. "Do not compliment him," Brenda shrieked. "Arrest him, or issue a citation for illegal construction." Officer Martinez turned his attention to me. He looked exhausted. "Sir, Can you explain to me why you have a military checkpoint on your front lawn? Certainly, Officer Martinez, I said, setting my coffee down. I picked up my manila folder and handed the glossy FEMA map over the wall to him. As you can see by this federal floodplain map, my property is located squarely within FEMA Zone AE. We are in a high-risk flood hazard area. Martinez looked at the map, then back up at me. Okay, you live in a flood zone. We're in Charleston, buddy. Half the city is in a flood zone. Exactly, I agreed. And according to the National Flood Insurance Program's pre-disaster mitigation guidelines, homeowners are strongly encouraged and federally protected to deploy temporary flood barriers, such as sandbags, to protect property and mitigate water damage. I pulled out the printed NFIP guideline page and handed to Jenkins. The HOA president here, I gestured to Brenda, who was practically vibrating with rage, attempted to fine me $500 for a 2-foot wire garden fence, claiming it was an unauthorized perimeter structure. So, to ensure I was in full compliance with her strict interpretation of the bylaws, I removed the wire fence. But I couldn't leave my property completely unprotected from the elements. So, I took federal advice and deployed an emergency flood barrier. Officer Jenkins was reading the FEMA printout. He bit his lower lip. I could see his shoulders shaking slightly. He was trying very, very hard not to laugh. Ma'am, Martinez said, turning slowly back to Brenda. He's got bags of dirt on his grass. It's a structure, Brenda insisted, pointing her clipboard at me like a weapon. It requires an architectural review. It requires permits. He is violating community standards. Ma'am, Martinez repeated, his voice dropping into the flat, monotone register of a cop who is officially done with a conversation. We do not enforce community aesthetic standards. We enforce the law. Is he blocking the public sidewalk? Well, no. But is he blocking the public roadway? No, but he's. Is he threatening anyone with a weapon, disturbing the peace with excessive noise, or committing a criminal act? He is disturbing my peace by making me look at it, Brenda yelled. Officer Jenkins finally lost the battle. He let out a sharp snort of laughter, quickly covering his mouth with the back of his hand and pretending to cough. Mrs. Brenda, is it? Martinez said, handing the FEMA map back over the sandbags to me. This is a civil matter. It is between you, the homeowner, and whatever lawyers you want to hire. But from a law enforcement perspective, this man has placed bags of dirt on his own private property. That is not a crime. In fact, if the federal government says he's supposed to do it, I'm certainly not going to tell him to tear it down. You have to be joking, Brenda whispered, her world crumbling around her. You're just going to let him get away with this? Have a good day, ma'am, Martinez said. He turned to me and gave me a slight, respectful nod. Stay dry, sir. You too, officers. Stay safe out there, I replied. Jenkins and Martinez walked back to their cruiser. Before Jenkins opened the passenger door, he looked back at the wall, gave me a subtle thumbs up, and got in. The Explorer pulled away from the curb, did a slow U-turn at the end of the cul-de-sac, and drove off, leaving the neighborhood to its own devices. Gary, across the street, started a slow, deliberate clap from his lawn chair. Brenda was left standing on the sidewalk, completely alone. Her ultimate weapon, the police, had come, laughed at her, and left. She looked at the sandbags. She looked at the driveway where the dump truck had been. She looked utterly, profoundly defeated. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at me, her chest heaving beneath her beige windbreaker. I picked up my coffee mug. I looked at her with an expression of pure, polite professionalism. Oh, and Brenda? One last thing, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet morning air. Please be very careful not to step on or lean against the barricade on your way out. She glared at me. Why? She spat. Because doing so compromises the structural integrity of my emergency flood defenses, I smiled. And tampering with federally recognized mitigation equipment during hurricane season? Now that might actually be a crime. She spun around so fast I thought she might snap her ankle, and storm marched down the street, disappearing around the corner. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted like sweet, sweet victory. But I knew the war wasn't over. Brenda had been humiliated. But HOA boards are like hydras. You cut off one head, and they send you a cease and desist letter from a lawyer. The real battle was still to come. But for today, my petunias were safe, and my fortress was impenetrable.